In 1955, Chevrolet sold 1.7 million cars in a single year. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler together controlled 95% of the American automobile market. They employed 1 in 6 working Americans, generated more annual revenue than most sovereign nations, and built vehicles the size of the living rooms. A Cadillac weighed 2.5 tons. A Buick Roadmaster came standard with a V8 engine and enough chrome to blind you at noon. These were not just cars, they were national symbols rolling proof that America had won the war, won the peace, and owned the future. Into this cathedral of industrial supremacy sailed 2 small Japanese sedans, unloaded from a cargo ship in California in August 1957. The Toyopet Crown, a vehicle powered by a 1.4-litre engine producing 60 horsepower. Its top speed was 72 miles per hour in theory. On American freeways, it struggled past 60 before the valves began to fail. Push the brakes too hard, which American drivers routinely did, and the wheel cylinders would blow apart entirely. The car shook at highway speed. It overheated in summer traffic. The American press called it underpowered, overpriced, and fundamentally unsuited to the country it had come to conquer. In 3 years of trying, Toyota sold exactly 1,913 Toyopet Crowns in America. Ford, in the same period, sold over 3 million. Toyota withdrew, humiliated. What happened next is one of the most precise, patient, and devastating corporate campaigns in the history of capitalism. And almost nobody tells it straight. To understand what Toyota walked into, you need to understand the psychology of Detroit in the 1950s. This was not confidence. It was something closer to religion. In 1955, Chevrolet alone sold 1.7 million cars. General Motors had a larger research budget than most American universities. Ford had pioneered the assembly line and made the car a mass-market product. Chrysler was engineering V8 engines powerful enough to reach 60 miles per hour in under 10 seconds. Decades before, that was considered remarkable. The big three were not competing with anyone. They were simply dividing an empire among themselves. The cultural weight behind this was enormous. After World War II, the American car had become the primary symbol of freedom, prosperity, and masculinity. A bigger engine meant status. A longer wheelbase meant success. The 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, the 1955 Ford Thunderbird, and the Chrysler 300 with its NASCAR-derived engine. These were objects of genuine desire sold into a country that had the highest wages, the longest roads, and the cheapest petrol on earth. An American family buying a car was not comparing specifications, they were buying an identity. The big three had not yet faced serious competition. Europe was rebuilding. Japan was an occupied nation still dependent on American financial support. The idea that either continent could threaten Detroit was not just dismissed. It was never seriously considered. That blind spot was not laziness. It was built on decades of genuine dominance. And genuine dominance, sustained long enough, eventually becomes an inability to imagine losing. Toyota was about to teach them what that inability costs. In August 1957, Toyota sent 3 representatives to Los Angeles to survey the American market. They arrived ahead of the first 2 Toyopet Crown models, which docked in California on August 25th. 2 months later, Toyota Motor Sales USA was established in a former Rambler dealership in Hollywood. The problem revealed itself almost immediately. The Toyopet Crown's 1,453 cubic centimeter 4-cylinder engine had a 0 to 60 time of 26 seconds, a standing quarter mile of 23.4 seconds, and a top speed that was in practice inadvisable to attempt. At sustained highway speed, the valves lost integrity. The engine overheated in California traffic. The wheel cylinders tended to blow apart under a firm American foot on the brake pedal. The suspension, built for the damaged and narrow roads of post-war Japan, shook badly on American freeways. The car had been designed for a country where 40 miles per hour was a reasonable cruising speed. American interstates demanded 70. Total US sales in 1958 amounted to 288 vehicles, 287 Crowns and 1 Land Cruiser. Toyota sold only 1,913 Toyopet Crowns in America in total, before pulling the model in December 1960. The American press was not kind. Automotive journalists described the car as unsuitable for the market. Dealers refused to carry it. In 1958, Ford sold 1 million cars, and that was considered a bad year for Ford. The humiliation was total. Toyota had brought a vehicle designed for one world and dropped it into another without understanding the difference. They had assumed that a car people liked in Japan would naturally appeal to Americans. That assumption had just cost them 3 years, significant capital, and their reputation in the largest automobile market on Earth. Now they had a choice: give up or go back to work. If you want to understand how a company turns total humiliation into the most dominant market position in automotive history, subscribe now. This is where it gets interesting. Most companies, facing a failure of that magnitude in a foreign market, would leave and not return. Toyota did something harder. Toyota suspended US car sales at the end of 1960. Then Eiji Toyoda and his engineering team did something that would define the company for the next 6 decades. They bought American cars, dozens of them. They drove them on American roads. They tore them down to individual components on workshop floors in Toyota City and studied every part, not to copy them, but to understand what American consumers actually needed and to measure precisely where Japanese engineering fell short. The 1957 Toyopet had not failed because Japan could not build cars. It had failed because Toyota had asked the wrong question. They had asked, "Will Americans buy our car?" The right question was, what car do Americans actually need, and can we build it better than anyone else? This distinction matters enormously. The first question leads to incremental adjustment. The second question leads to a total rebuild from first principles. Eiji Toyoda returned to Japan having answered the second question. He knew that American roads demanded durability at sustained high speed. He knew American consumers wanted reliability above all else, because American highways did not forgive breakdowns. He knew that a car's quality had to be built into its production, not inspected at the end. What followed was not product development. It was an entirely new theory of manufacturing. While Detroit was adding fins and chrome, Taiichi Ohno and Eiji Toyoda were forging a new production philosophy between 1948 and 1975 through thousands of small experiments, failures, and corrections. The Toyota production system started from a single observation. In the early 1950s, Ohno was inspired by accounts of the American supermarket. The concept was simple but revolutionary for manufacturing. A customer takes what they need from a shelf, and the store replenishes only what was taken. No overproduction, no waste. Every stage of production pulls from the previous stage only what was actually needed, precisely when it was needed. They called this just-in-time manufacturing. The second pillar was jidoka, the principle that quality had to stop the production line, not clear it. In traditional American mass production, the assembly line never stopped. Quality was a separate department that inspected vehicles at the end. Defects were caught, rerouted, and reworked at enormous hidden cost. Toyota made every worker responsible for quality. Any worker could halt the entire line the moment something went wrong. At Toyota, from executives to assembly line workers, there was a belief that no process is ever perfect. Everything can and should be improved continuously. They called this Kaizen, not a slogan, a daily operating reality. Ohno famously drew a chalk circle on the factory floor and had engineers stand inside it for hours, observing a single process, asking what waste they could see. In 1950, Toyota was making roughly 2,500 cars a year. Ford was producing nearly 8,000 cars every single day. Toyota could not win on volume, so they decided to win by precision. Through the 1960s, Toyota quietly re-entered the American market. The 1965 Corolla arrived with a larger engine, better engineering, and a price point that undercut the cheapest American compacts. Sales were modest but growing. By the early 1970s, the Corolla had joined it. Detroit noticed, shrugged, and returned to building muscle cars. The logic was not irrational at the time. American consumers with money bought American cars. The compact segment in which small foreign vehicles competed was the low end of the market. People bought small cars because they could not afford big ones. The moment their income rose, they traded up to a Chevrolet or a Ford. Japanese and European imports were, in the view of Detroit's senior executives, a permanent niche for the budget-conscious. Not a threat, not an alternative, just an entry-level category that American manufacturers could safely ignore while focusing on the profitable full-size and mid-size segments. The Big Three had not faced serious competition before. Their management structures had been built in a different era, and those structures rewarded short-term volume over long-term product quality. When Detroit attempted compact cars, GM's answer was the Chevrolet Vega, which suffered from engine and corrosion issues. Ford's compact was the Pinto, which became notorious for safety problems involving rear-end collisions and fuel tank fires. Detroit was not incapable of building small cars, it was incapable of believing small cars mattered. In October 1973, reality corrected that belief overnight. On October 17, 1973, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries announced an oil embargo targeting nations that had supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War. The United States was at the top of that list. Within weeks, petrol prices quadrupled. Queues stretched around city blocks. Rationing was introduced in several states. The cost of filling a large American V8 engine went from manageable to genuinely punishing almost overnight. Detroit had built the 1970s American car for a world where petrol was cheap and plentiful. The average American car in 1973 returned roughly 13 miles per gallon. The Arab oil embargo forced consumers to abandon Detroit's V8 vehicles for fuel-efficient imports. Big Three sales collapsed. GM was down 34%. Ford was down 47%. Chrysler came within weeks of insolvency. The companies that had dominated the most profitable automobile market on Earth for 50 years had no credible answer to the question American consumers were now asking every single week at the petrol pump. Toyota had an answer. They had been building it for 16 years. The Corolla returned 30 miles per gallon. It started reliably, cost significantly less to run than any American equivalent, and critically, it did not break down. The quality that Taiichi Ono had engineered into Toyota's production line in the 1950s and 1960s now had a commercial context that American consumers could feel in their wallets every time they drove. The perfect storm had arrived. Toyota was already standing in the eye of it, fully prepared. Japanese market share surged from roughly 9% in 1976 to 21% by 1980. Imports captured 28% of the US market by the end of the decade. The Corolla was the weapon. By 1980, it was among the best-selling cars in the United States, outperforming long-established models like the Volkswagen Beetle. The car that American executives had dismissed as suitable only for people who could not afford better had become the car that Americans with choices were actively choosing. What Toyota understood, and what Detroit had entirely missed, was that the oil crisis had not just changed purchasing decisions, it had changed purchasing psychology. Consumers who bought a Toyota Corolla in 1974 or 1975 discovered something that permanently altered their relationship with the concept of car ownership. The car worked. Every time. Without drama, without repeated workshop visits, without expensive maintenance cycles. For a generation of Americans who had grown up treating mechanical unreliability as an accepted feature of car ownership, this was genuinely revelatory. Reliability had never been a sales category in the American market because American manufacturers had never competed on it. Detroit competed on power, on size, on design, and on financing terms. Toyota competed on whether the car would actually function as promised day after day, year after year. Once a consumer experienced that, brand loyalty to Detroit did not erode gradually, it collapsed, and the people who switched did not switch back. By 1980, Toyota was selling over 580,000 vehicles annually in the United States. The company that had arrived with 287 cars in 1958 was now moving more volume in a single month than it had managed in its entire first 3 years. In 1980, automobile production in Japan topped 10 million vehicles, putting Japan ahead of the United States as the world's largest automobile-producing country for the first time. Toyota. Detroit responded the way dominant institutions respond when they are losing, by going to the government. In February 1980, United Auto Workers President Douglas Fraser visited Japan personally to pressure Japanese automakers into restricting their own exports. Later that year, the UAW formally claimed that rising unemployment was caused by Japanese cars and took the matter to the US International Trade Commission. Ford joined with the same argument, with management and labor uniting to request protectionist import restrictions. In February 1981, US senators introduced legislation to impose a quota of 1.6 million units on Japanese automobile imports, receiving strong support from the Senate. The pressure worked. On May 1, 1981, Japanese automakers agreed to limit exports to 1.68 million units per year under a voluntary export restraint program supported by the Reagan administration. Read that again. The companies that had laughed a Japanese manufacturer off American roads in 1957 were now lobbying Congress to legally limit how many Japanese cars Americans were allowed to buy. The industry that had once called the Toyopet a joke was now asking the federal government to protect it from the punchline. The program remained in place until 1994, 13 years of government protection, and it changed almost nothing. Toyota simply built plants inside American borders to sidestep the quotas entirely and continued taking market share. The quotas did not save Detroit. They postponed its reckoning. By the mid-1980s, Toyota had opened manufacturing facilities in Kentucky. The Camry, built on American soil by American workers, became the best-selling car in the United States for much of the following 2 decades. The company that had sold 287 cars in its first year in America was now one of the 2 or 3 most powerful automotive brands on earth. But the deeper shift was not in market share. It was what consumers now expected a car to be. Before Toyota, reliability was not a standard. It was a bonus. American consumers budgeted for mechanical failure the way they budgeted for bad weather, as an unpleasant but accepted feature of ownership. Toyota removed that assumption from the market. Japanese automakers permanently changed consumer expectations, filling the gap with smaller, more reliable vehicles that appealed to the cost-conscious American consumer. Once that expectation existed, it could not be walked back. Every manufacturer on Earth now competes on reliability, fuel efficiency, and long-term ownership cost. Those are Toyota's metrics. Toyota put them there. Eiji Toyoda, the engineer who stood in the rubble of the 1957 Toyopet disaster, and chose to learn rather than retreat, built a company that outlasted every structural advantage his competitors possessed. Not through volume, not through government protection, and not through marketing. Through the unglamorous, daily, obsessive pursuit of making things correctly. Detroit asked, "How many cars can we sell today?" Toyota asked, "How do we build a car so good that the customer never considers anything else?" The answer to that second question became the benchmark for every industry that followed. That is the real legacy, not a car company, a standard. If this story changed how you think about competition, quality, and what it actually takes to win a market, subscribe. This is what financial storytelling looks like when the numbers are real and the stakes are higher than anyone admits.